This is Chris K with your Peak Fitness upper and lower body muscle breakout video. The purpose of muscle breakouts is to allow us to figure out which muscles are stiff, short, and which muscles may require a little bit extra stretching. Alright, so once we've looked at our clients in standing positions, we see that they've got maybe issues with their ankles, with their lower body, whatever it may be. We're going to look at the mobility of their and the flexibility of their muscles to just kind of check, double check. Alright, so starting with the upper extremity, we've got a couple things that we want to look at. First and foremost, we want to look at the client's internal and external rotation of their shoulder. Alright, so for internal rotation, what I'm going to do is simply turn around. I'm going to ask the client to place one hand on their opposite shoulder blade. Alright, it should look like they can get up to about here. They should be able to touch the back of their hand to their shoulder blade. If they're way down here, it feels stiff, they feel popping in there, then that tells us that the client is lacking in internal rotation. Really what that means in practical application is that every time they pull something over their head to a certain point, their shoulders have to come forward. So we can see how that would really cause some shoulder issues, and we'll show you some stretches for that in subsequent videos. All right, we're going to check side to side, kind of compare one side to the other, and just make a simple note, which side is an issue and which side we give them a stretch on. Alright, by the same token, we're going to look at external rotation of the shoulder and flexion. So with this, I'm just going to put my hand over my head, and again, try to touch my opposite shoulder. I'm kind of lacking in this area, and I can see that with this, I'm not able to get my hand to my opposite shoulder, so this is an area that I want to stretch in particular. Alright, I'm going to look on the other side, and really I have the same issue. So this is something that I would give, me if I were a client. So those are two things that we can look at almost immediately. For our next test, we're going to do what is called overhead abduction. Right? With this, what I'm going to ask the client to do is just place each hand on their hands to their sides, raise their hands over their head, and touch their hands to the back of their head. Once again, this is an area in which I'm limited, so I'm not able to get my palms, the backs of my hands together. They should be able to get together overhead, to tell us whether or not the client is able to get their arms over their head. What this means is that when we press overhead, we both flex the shoulder and we abduct. So we don't just go up, we go out. Right? If the client can't do that, oftentimes what we see is a shrugging of the shoulder, kind of substituting with this area, and kind of an increased risk of maybe some rotator cuff issues. So if we see this in a client, we definitely want to look at some stretching for this and avoid overhead pressing until we clear this up. All right, now for our last test, what we're going to do is what is called supine shoulder flexion. Okay, with this, what I'm going to ask the client to do, supine simply means I'm going to ask them to lay on their back. Alright, I'm going to have the client tighten their abs, hands are up, just let the hands drop behind their head. Okay, once again, the client should be able to get the hands straight on the ground. And you'll notice that I'm pretty restricted. I'm not able to get my hands to the ground, and I am missing some key components of flexion. I would not press overhead right now simply because I need to reclaim this before I do so. If the client is here, versus on the ground, we know that when they press overhead, alright, I'll stand up to show you this. When they press overhead, they're going to be pressing it above their head, or I'm sorry, in front of their body versus straight overhead. That's definitely a liability. Again, that's a major cause for concern. So if we see this in a client, we want to eliminate overhead pressing. This is not something that we want to do until we clear these things up with some stretches. All right. So with that said, we're now going to look at the lower body. All right. For the lower body, what I'm going to ask the client to begin by doing is simply lying on their back. Alright, it's a little hard for me to demonstrate this because I need a live subject, but you can have the client do this both actively and passively in the sense where you actually move their muscles or just have them move them themselves. Alright, with this, the first thing I'm going to look at is dorsiflexion. So watching my ankles here, I'm just going to ask the client to pull their ankles back as far as they can. And again, it should be able to flex back pretty far. Like I'm at about 0 degrees of dorsiflexion, meaning we're like highlighting my terrible mobility today, but the client, right now I'm like here. The client should be able to get back almost to at least another 10 to 20 degrees. And what you want to do at the same time is really feel on that muscle. If the end range feels stiff, like really stiff, like you've hit a wall versus kind of spongy and soft, that means that there's probably some restrictions in that muscle. The client will also comment about being stiff, and that's just something you want to make a note of. Compare right to left, see if one side has more range than the other, and just move on to your next test. For our next movement, alright, we have a straight leg lift. Okay, with this, I'm simply going to ask the client to raise their leg up to about 90 degrees. And again, I have about 85, 90 degrees here. This is about right. I'm just going to compare this to the other side. Okay, and again, with this, what I'm looking for is not only whether or not the client can raise it up, I'm looking at the position of the opposite leg. Right? If I get to a certain point, my leg starts to raise off the table or the ground, that tells me that they're substituting with structures other than their hamstring here. So basically the client has run out of range of motion and now is kind of moving from the low back or other areas to gain a little bit more range. Right? You want to cue the client to press their back into the ground the whole time and see whether or not that limits that movement. Again, you can press on the hamstrings to, again, see if it's kind of really stiff versus kind of soft and spongy, and make a note of that. The hamstrings are definitely one that we want to maybe stay away from stretching from initially, simply because we don't know if it's a protective issue or there's some other things going on. There are many more things involved with the hamstrings in particular, but it's definitely something to make note of. All right, we want to compare side to side. The other thing that I would be looking for from this is whether or not the client's kind of foot is turning out. I can also place my hands on the client's pelvis to see if I get any rotation of the torso. If I do, as the client's lifting up, that tells me that we might have a little bit of a pelvic shift going on, and this is another thing to make note of. All right, now for our last couple of tests, we're going to ask the client to bring their knee to their chest. Okay, and with this, the client should be able to get to about 120 degrees. The knee should come to about the the nipple or the pec. If not, if they're down here, that tells us they have a tight hip flex or a tight psoas, and this is definitely something that we want to stretch. We'll compare side to side. Once again, you want to push on that to kind of feel whether or not it feels springy versus kind of stiff. And then we're going to check external rotation as I come this way. Again, the client should be up at about 90 degrees. I'm at about maybe 75, so this is something to look at. We'll compare side to side. Turn a little bit more this way so you can see me here. Turning this way. Then I'm going to look at internal rotation, which I just asked them where I push the leg this way. Okay, you're going to have a little bit more external than internal rotation, but the key is that this is going to feel stiff, and this is also pretty limited in me. I mean, I should have about 35 degrees. I should be maybe out about here, and I'm over here. So this is something we see often, and this is something the client needs to work on also. All right, and for what we're going to do is just compare this to lying on the stomach. All right, now this just gives me another vantage point to check on here, and the first thing that I'm going to do is just do a heel to butt test. Okay, and you're just going to ask the client to flex their heel to their butt. They should be able to get the heel within several centimeters of the butt. I mean, it should be pretty close. And the other thing to watch for here is the pelvis. Okay, if the pelvis is shifting up, okay, then we know that they're compensating like we talked about. So really the true range of motion is where they can get without kind of raising up like that. All right, so we're going to check side to side. Look at that. I'm also going to look at external rotation, in which the client brings their heel to the opposite leg, and then internal rotation where they do this. The key here again is to watch the pelvis. If the pelvis shifts to the side, then that's not true range. That's more compensation somewhere. So we want to you can kind of hold down the pelvis here as the client is moving through to really look at their true range of motion, and just kind of compare from side to side, so we have kind of a good comparison there. But make note of all of those things. We'll explain some corrective stuff, some stretches in subsequent videos, but the key is we're not stretching the wrong structures, we're not mobilizing things that don't need to be. All right, so make those notes and move on to your corrective exercise.